Hi, I'm John Cohen. Welcome to another episode of Hypothetically Speaking. In the past week or two, Tucker Carlson has taken a fairly aggressive stance against Dr. Fauci and has called him out both on his show on Fox News, but also on Tucker Today, which I think is a subscription-only service from Fox. And I wanted to share with you folks some of these clips from some of what Tucker's been talking about and do a little bit of fact-checking and see if the things that Tucker's talking about, are they in fact accurate? And we'll back that up and we'll look at the sources from the CDC and the FDA, and we'll go to Johns Hopkins and the WHO if we need to. But what I really wanted to do was just kind of break down where Tucker's coming from and which tree he's barking up, so to speak, and see if we can answer the question, is Tucker on a little bit of a wild goose chase with the right intentions, but going in the wrong direction? And if so, can we help straighten him out? I'm John Cohen. This is Hypothetically Speaking. Let's get started.
Tony Fauci is punishing the country, you, us, everyone. The question is, why is he doing that? Maybe he likes it, that's possible. But you've got to think that at least part of Tony Fauci's authoritarian germ hysteria is a cover for something else. Could it be that Tony Fauci is trying to divert attention from himself and his own personal role in the COVID-19 pandemic?
That's pretty big. So based on that...
Now, what do we mean by that? We cannot recommend more strongly a new piece by Nicholas Wade, who for more than 50 years has been one of the preeminent science writers in the world. For 30 years, Nicholas Wade worked for the New York Times. He edited the science section there, but this piece did not run in the New York Times. It ran on Medium. And the piece explains where this virus almost certainly came from. In it, Nicholas Wade makes it clear that more than any other single living American, Tony Fauci is responsible for the COVID-19 pandemic.
All right, those are some pretty strong words, and that's sort of the genesis of this video. So Tucker's coming out pretty strong, and it sounds like he's going after Dr. Fauci, but is Tucker's premise the root cause premise? So is he going after the right body of evidence, or is he simply going after a body of evidence that is being talked about a lot and is in the public's awareness at a fairly high level right now? We kind of focus on the facts here, so we focus on evidence. And so I want to see where Tucker's going with this. And the question again is he on a little bit of a wild goose chase, but with the best of intentions? And if that's the case, can we help steer him back in the right direction? So let's continue with the video and see where Tucker's going with this.
Wade lays out a nearly insurmountably large amount of evidence that this virus originated at the Wuhan Institute of Virology in central China. It seemed to make sense. This show and others had raised the possibility from the early days of the pandemic. But this piece all but proves it. At the time the outbreak began last fall, the Wuhan lab was conducting experiments on how to make bat viruses infectious to human beings.
All right, so to a certain extent, I believe that this is a bit of a wild goose chase and a bit of a red herring. The origins of the coronavirus, from my perspective, that is less important an aspect of the story given the number of people that we have dead in places like Vietnam, Taiwan, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, Malaysia, Myanmar, which used to be called Burma. So when I look through Asia, even Australia doesn't yet have 1,000 people dead. I look at New Zealand, less than 30 people dead. I look at Malaysia, Kuala Lumpur. We look at Bangladesh. There's no good explanation for that phenomenon that we're seeing. So is SARS-CoV-2 as deadly as Americans have been told it is, given that there aren't 10 people dead in Shanghai, there aren't 10 people dead in Beijing, there aren't 500 dead in Hong Kong, and there aren't 5,000 dead in all of China. And Japan has fewer people dead than Ohio. And South Carolina has more people dead than South Korea. So with those types of comparisons, the question Tucker should be asking is SARS-CoV-2 as deadly as Americans have been told, rather than exactly where did it come from and bats or pangolins or whatever. To me, that's less important at this time. What's more important is the root cause of what killed over 500,000 Americans. Let's continue with the video.
Experiments were funded by American tax dollars. Those experiments were, their funding, approved and directed by Tony Fauci in Washington. By Tony Fauci. That is hard to believe, but it's true, and the piece lays it out.
So that's true. Fauci and the NIH and the NIAID don't send the money directly to Wuhan. They go through organizations, and Tucker's going to talk about that. He's going to talk about Peter Daszak, who's a key person in all this. And this is great. So this aspect of the story is important, particularly the Peter Daszak aspect of it. The fact that the funding is coming from the NIH to go to Wuhan is relevant, but there's an earlier aspect of the story that Tucker's not talking about, that David Hopkins broke, and we're going to get into that. All right, but let's hear Tucker out. Let's see what Tucker has to say.
The Wuhan experiments fell under the direction of a Chinese researcher called Shi Zhengli, known as the Bat Lady. She was China's leading expert on bat-borne viruses. Her job was to genetically engineer coronaviruses so that they infect human beings and do so as easily as possible. This work, Nicholas Wade notes, involved, quote, doing gain-of-function experiments designed to make coronavirus infect human cells. Now, why was this research going on? We'll have to ask the scientists who did it. But the fact remains, these were some of the most dangerous experiments ever conducted by mankind. And yet we know that China was not taking necessary safety precautions, and we should not be surprised by that.
So the question is, Tucker, how do you know that they weren't taking necessary safety
Several years ago,
precautions?
American diplomatic cables warned about low and lax standards at the Wuhan lab. In fact, the Wuhan facility was classified as a biosafety level 2 laboratory. What does that mean? Well, according to Richard Ebright, who's a molecular biologist at Rutgers, that is approximately the same level of safety that you would find in a dentist's office in America.
All right, so Tucker, you probably didn't see my video. So that lab conducting research, experiments on the coronavirus and how to make it transmissible to human beings resulted almost certainly in the infection of a lab researcher, and the virus spread from there. The first coronavirus patients, in fact, did not come from the so-called wet market, as we heard. That was a lie. The first patients of the coronavirus, in fact, were employees at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, at the lab. So yes, the Wuhan lab has security issues and safety issues and things like that that we should be looking at, and their funding is relevant. But if the virus came to the Wuhan lab from Winnipeg, hypothetically speaking, wouldn't that also be relevant? And it seems like that's something that Tucker's just simply not aware of, that there's a connection between Dr. Chu from Winnipeg and Wuhan. So let's take a look at where Tucker goes with this, and then we'll introduce Tucker to this twist on the story with Dr. Chu from Winnipeg, and what is her connection to Wuhan, and might that be the original source of this coronavirus that shows up at the Wuhan lab. And, again, Tucker seems to mean well, but if he's not aware of the Winnipeg connection, he's not at the root cause. So let's go further with Tucker.
On the coronavirus and how to make it transmissible to human beings resulted almost certainly in the infection of a lab researcher, and the virus spread from there. The first coronavirus patients, in fact, did not come from the so-called wet market, as we heard. That was a lie. The first patients of the coronavirus, in fact, were employees at the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
Now, I'm not sure where he's getting that from, and he doesn't cite a source. So this is new information. If the first patients of coronavirus were from the Wuhan lab themselves, I hadn't heard that, and yet he's not providing us a source. So I don't know if that came from the WHO's report, and I just haven't read it. If any of you are watching, know what that source is, and you can put in the comments in this video, that would be great, because I don't know where Tucker's getting that from. But Tucker's telling us that the first coronavirus patients worked at the Wuhan lab. In fact, let me, I'll rewind this a couple seconds so you hear this again.
The first patients of the coronavirus, in fact, were employees at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, at the lab.
All right. This is Dr. Chu. And Dr. Chu...
So once again, why would the Wuhan lab be conducting experiments like that in the first place?
All right, so that's, to me, that question of why would they be doing it in the first place, that's the wild goose chase. When we have Dr. Chu. Dr. Chu, world renowned. She plays a huge role in the Ebola treatment, the therapeutic treatment for Ebola known as ZMapp. Ultimately does not get FDA approval, but they develop it. It seems like it's effective, and she wins all sorts of accolades. And she works in Winnipeg. And so this aspect, to me, takes us closer to root cause than did the researchers in Wuhan go to a cave and scrape up bat feces or something like that. To me, that's the wild goose chase. We should be looking at Dr. Chu. And again, David Hopkins, I think, was talking about this in January, and that's why you're going to see some counter propaganda that came out of Canada in January of 2020. January. I mean, we only knew the virus was contagious between people as of January 22nd. And by January 29th, the Canadian broadcasting system was already putting out counter propaganda about conspiracies, I guess based on David Hawkins' reporting.
The coronavirus is spreading fast, but so is misinformation. Much of it is stoked by fears online. In one case, a CBC story from last summer was used to spread false information about the origins of the coronavirus. The original story revealed that a researcher, her husband, and some of their graduate students were escorted out of the National Microbiology Lab in Winnipeg amidst an RCMP investigation into what the Public Health Agency of Canada described as a possible policy breach and administrative matter. That part is true. Here's how the story was twisted into a conspiracy theory about the coronavirus. American businessman Kyle Bass tweeted that a husband and wife Chinese spy team were recently removed from a level 4 infectious disease facility in Canada for sending pathogens to the Wuhan facility. That story has gone viral. Some versions of it claim the Chinese government weaponized the virus and released it on innocent people. One article from a conspiracy blog was shared more than 6,000 times on Facebook. The story even made its way on Chinese-owned social media app TikTok, where a video pushing these claims was watched more than 350,000 times. CBC reporting has never claimed the two scientists were spies or that they brought any version of the coronavirus to the lab in Wuhan. After repeated requests, Canada's Public Health Agency has released this statement. This is misinformation, and there is no factual basis for claims being made on social media. Experts say disinformation about the coronavirus is creating a social panic online.
The broader damage is that there grows a mistrust towards both government authorities, public health officials, the media, authoritative sources of media, and then one has a kind of social media environment where speculation, rumor, and conspiracy theories take over and really wash out the factual information that is being promoted online.
As with most conspiracy theories, there are kernels of truth that are being distorted. Here's what's true. We know Jianguo Chu is a medical doctor and virologist from Tianjin, China. She came to Canada for graduate studies in 1996. She's still affiliated with universities there and has brought in many students over the years to help with her work. Chu's husband, Keating Chang, works at the Winnipeg lab as a biologist. He's published research papers on other coronaviruses, including SARS. We have reported that scientists at the National Microbiology Lab sent live Ebola and Henipa viruses to Beijing on an Air Canada flight last March. The Public Health Agency of Canada said all federal policies were followed, but the agency still has not confirmed if that shipment is part of the RCMP investigation into the two scientists. We do know, contrary to social media posts, that the coronavirus was not part of that shipment. In another story, we reported that Chu made at least 5 trips to China in 2017 to 18. That included one to train scientists and technicians at China's newly certified Level 4 lab. It's in Wuhan and does research with the most deadly pathogens. Again, Canada's Public Health Agency has denied any connection between the RCMP investigation, Chu's visits to Wuhan, or any Canadian research with this coronavirus outbreak. But it won't answer questions on the current status of Chu and Chang, citing privacy reasons. The Canadian government still has to release a lot of information, but it is in no way related to the disinformation we're seeing about bioweapons and spies. This expert says governments and public health authorities need to do a better job of communicating facts at times like this, on social media and in the languages of the communities impacted.
It's incredibly challenging during fast-moving outbreaks of any type of disease to balance between information to keep the public safe and prevent something becoming a massive epidemic, and also trying to provide truthful information, and then finally providing enough so that you don't end up with a vacuum, which is where disinformation can flourish.
This is becoming an increasingly important part of the public health communication strategy, because this won't be the last time we face disinformation during a potential epidemic.
And she is the one who was kicked out of the lab in Winnipeg. David Hopkins breaks this aspect of the story, and then he and I get on the same frequency. We both agree that, how do you ignore this aspect of the story? That just doesn't make any sense.
So once again, why would the Wuhan lab be conducting experiments like that in the first place? Well, we know that Tony Fauci had authorized payment for the research. For 5 years, from 2014 to 2019, the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, which Tony Fauci runs and has for decades, pumped money to a group called the EcoHealth Alliance. The EcoHealth Alliance is run by a man whose name you may recognize, Dr. Peter Daszak. Daszak contracted with Dr. Shi to conduct gain-of-function experiments at the Wuhan lab. Just before the pandemic became public knowledge, on December 9th, 2019, Peter Daszak sat for an interview that was streamed online. In that interview, Daszak bragged about how easy it is to manipulate coronaviruses in lab experiments.
Coronaviruses are pretty good. I mean, you're a virologist, you know all this stuff, but you can manipulate them in the lab pretty easily. It's just spike protein drives a lot of what happens with the coronavirus, zoonotic risk. So you can get the sequence, you can build the protein, and we work with Ralph Barrick at UNC to do this. Insert it into a backbone of another virus.
Right. All right. He just said we worked with Ralph Barrick at UNC, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. In Rand Paul's discussion with Dr. Fauci in the Senate a week ago, Rand Paul is questioning Dr. Fauci about gain of function, and Dr. Fauci slips and says if gain of function is being done, it's being done in North Carolina.
We do not fund.
Do you fund Dr. Barrett's gain-of-function research?
Dr. Barrett does not doing gain-of-function research, and if it is, it's according to the guidelines, and it is being conducted in North Carolina.
Gain-of-function research, as you know, is juicing up naturally occurring animal viruses to infect humans. To arrive at the truth, the U.S. government should admit that the Wuhan Virology Institute was experimenting to enhance the coronavirus's ability to infect humans. Juicing up superviruses is not new. Scientists in the U.S. have long known how to mutate animal viruses to infect humans. For years, Dr. Ralph Baric, a virologist in the U.S., has been collaborating with Dr. Shi Zhengli of the Wuhan Virology Institute, sharing his discoveries about how to create superviruses. This gain-of-function research has been funded by the NIH. The collaboration between the U.S. and the Wuhan Virology Institute continues. Doctors Baric and Shi worked together to insert bat virus spike protein into the backbone of the deadly SARS virus, and then use this man-made supervirus to infect human airway cells. Think about that for a moment. The SARS virus had a 15% mortality. We're fighting a pandemic that has about a 1% mortality. Can you imagine if a SARS virus that's been juiced up and had viral proteins added to it, to the spike protein, if that were released accidentally? Dr. Fauci, do you still support funding of the NIH funding of the lab in Wuhan?
Senator Paul, with all due respect, you are entirely and completely incorrect that the NIH has not ever and does not now fund gain-of-function research in the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
Do they fund Dr. Baric?
We do not fund.
Do you fund Dr. Barrett's gain-of-function research?
Dr. Barrett does not doing gain-of-function research, and if it is, it's according to the guidelines, and it is being conducted in North Carolina, not
You don't think
in
inserting
China.
a bat virus spike protein that he got from the Wuhan Institute into the SARS virus is gain-of-function?
That is
You would be
not-
in the minority because at least 200 scientists have signed a statement from the Cambridge Working Group saying that it is gain-of-function.
Well, it is not. And if you look at the grant and you look at the progress reports, it is not gain-of-function, despite the fact that people tweet that.
So
they
do
write
you still
about it.
support sending money to the Wuhan Virology Institute?
We do not send money now to the Wuhan
Do you
Virology
support
Institute.
sending money? We did under your tutelage. We were sending it through EcoHealth. It was a
And do some work in the lab.
Peter Daszak.
So just days after that was shot, it became clear that this new version of coronavirus, this novel coronavirus, what we now call COVID-19, was running rampant through Wuhan, then China, and then the world. Since then, since the
Whoa. Running rampant through China? Who told you that? Who told you that, Tucker? How many people were dead in China, Tucker? So that's the illusion. Now, at this point, I have to conclude that Tucker has fallen for the illusion and believes that coronavirus ran rampant through China. Yet there aren't 5,000 people dead in China, meaning there's more dead in Connecticut. Right, so if that's the case, most people would find that to be, people say, well, then China's lying. But Vietnam has 100 million people and doesn't have 50 dead. And Taiwan is right next to China, and they hate China, right? They're almost at war. Taiwan has, I think, almost 24 million people, which is more than New York City, and they don't have 15 dead. Not 20 dead in Taiwan with 24 million people. So if China's lying, is everybody lying? South Korea, with 51 million people, has less dead than South Carolina. South Carolina only has 5 million people. So with 10 times the population, they have a fraction of the deaths in South Korea. So, all of Asia can't be lying. Now, you can't say that every country in Asia is lying, because then we go to Nigeria and we find out that Nigeria has fewer people dead than Rhode Island. But Nigeria has over 200 million people. So all these countries can't be lying. But Tucker seems to be under the impression that China was ravaged by the coronavirus. And since there aren't 10 people dead in Beijing and there aren't 10 people dead in Shanghai, it seems like that's not the case. So let's listen to what Tucker said again one more time, and then we'll continue. So what did Tucker just say?
Was running rampant through Wuhan, then China, and then the world.
Running rampant through Wuhan, then China, then the world. So Tucker thinks there's a whole lot of people dead in China. That's not the case. Let's continue.
Since the pandemic began, Peter Daszak, not surprisingly, has appeared on virtually every media platform available to him to deny, in the most strenuous and dismissive terms, that the Wuhan lab could be in any way linked to the outbreak, since, of course, he has very personal motives for claiming that. Quote, "The idea that this virus escaped from a lab is just pure baloney," he said last year. But that was a lie. It's not pure baloney. And a lot of smart people knew that right away.
Now, I don't understand how Tucker just says this. Tucker makes these declarative statements and says that's a lie, but he's not backing it up with any evidence. So based on what? How do you know that's a lie, Tucker? So I don't like to make those strong declarative statements unless I've got a smoking gun piece of evidence. So, I certainly understand Tucker's frustration, but saying that that's a lie without hard evidence, I'm not comfortable with that. Yes, we were told there was no way the lab was at fault. That may be a lie, but I don't know. Let's see where he's going with this. Again, I think he goes a little too far at times. So let's see what Tucker says here.
Those people is Alina Chan, a molecular biologist at the Broad Institute at Harvard and MIT. She bravely wrote a paper about how the coronavirus's genome hadn't changed much over time, and that was odd because that genome had gone through trillions of replications. According to Chan, that fact implied that the virus was designed for human-to-human transmission from the outset. The former director of the CDC also clearly understood this, and he too argued that the virus came from the Wuhan lab.
I am of the point of view that I still think the most likely etiology of this pathogen in Wuhan was from a laboratory, escaped. Other people don't believe that. That's fine. Science will eventually figure it out. It's not unusual for respiratory pathogens that are being worked on in a laboratory to infect a laboratory worker.
Millions of people have died of COVID-19.
You sure about that, Tucker?
So it's not a matter of score settling or blame assignment to figure out where it came from. If you want to prevent the next global pandemic, you have to figure out how this one started. And so the World Health Organization said it would get to the bottom of it. The World Health Organization, of course, is beholden to China. And so it tried to hide the basic facts of the origins of this pandemic.
When Tucker says it's beholden to China, he should then show you the evidence that makes him say that. Why would you say that, Tucker? I have the accounts receivable document from the WHO that shows what each country pays, how much they owe. Now, if you were to show that document, Tucker, and show how much China pays compared to other countries, and it was much, much more than other countries, then making those declarative statements would make more sense. Right? So when you say that the WHO is beholden to China, based on what? What makes you say that? If you then said, now let me show you how much money China sends the WHO versus France, versus Germany, versus the UK, versus the United States, versus the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation gives more money to the WHO than many countries. And we'll take a look at that in a future episode. But let's continue and see what else Tucker has to say.
those facts. WHO appointed none other than Peter Daszak as the only America-based representative on the investigative team looking into where the virus came from. In what turned out to be a sham report, that team concluded that it's, quote, extremely unlikely that the virus came from the Wuhan lab. Again, that's not true. The WHO's investigation into the origins of the virus was fraudulent, and that matters to public health globally. But one thing you'll notice is that Tony Fauci did not say that.
Again, these accusations that it's not true and that it's fraudulent, based on what, Tucker? You have to demonstrate some evidence here, not just make these claims. So that's sort of where Tucker's losing me in this argument of his. And again, it's why I want to keep the discussion just based on evidence. And if we have evidence of a virologist who's going back and forth from Winnipeg to Wuhan, and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police kick her out of Canada with her husband, it's not part of the conversation. And this Dr. Lieber from Harvard, who gets arrested at roughly the same time, in the same window, that's not part of the dialogue. To me, that's a big part of the story that we're missing here, Tucker. So let's continue.
Why? Because once again, he is implicated in it personally. The gain-of-function research that Peter Daszak was bragging about in the video we just showed you had in fact been banned explicitly by the US government. There was a federal moratorium on the funding of exactly the kind of gain-of-function experiments that went on in the Wuhan lab to disastrous effects. So why didn't the US government halt its funding of the lab in Wuhan? That is a central question, and Nicholas Wade, to his great credit, looked into it. And here's what he found. Quote, someone wrote a loophole into the moratorium. The moratorium specifically barred funding of any gain-of-function research that increased the pathogenicity of the flu, MERS, or SARS viruses. But then a footnote on page 2 of the moratorium document states that, quote, an exception from the research pause may be obtained if the head of the U.S. government funding agency determines that the research is urgently necessary to protect the public health or national security. And that's exactly the loophole that was exploited. Who signed off on this? Tony Fauci, possibly along with Francis Collins, the director of the NIH, invoked that special exemption in order to keep funding the Wuhan lab and the deadly experiments that were going on there.
But if that virus that came from the Wuhan lab, SARS-CoV-2, has not killed 10 people in Beijing, and it has not killed 10 in Shanghai, and it has not killed 20 in Taiwan, it has not killed 1,000 in Thailand, how deadly is it? Really? Now, we know in America there's about 600,000 people that died with SARS-CoV-2, but many of those people had comorbidities. In fact, on average, the 95% of the people who died with SARS-CoV-2, according to the CDC, had 4 comorbidities on average. So that means more than half the people had more than 4 comorbidities on their death certificate. We know that the number 1 comorbidity was influenza and pneumonia, P&I. So that was number 1. And we know that of the 600,000 in the U.S., only 5% on their death certificate does it say just SARS-CoV-2 COVID with no other comorbidity. Just 5%. 5% of 600,000 is about 30,000 people. So it sounds like about 30,000 people died from just SARS-CoV-2, but then many, many, many more died with, on average, 4 comorbidities, of which the number 1 comorbidity was influenza. Tucker doesn't know this. So Tucker thinks 600,000 people died from COVID, but we have 550,000 that we know died with P&I, because we have that from the CDC's mortality system. So if we have a definitive 550,000 dead from a different virus, that's influenza. That's H1N1 most likely, pandemic influenza. That explains why it wasn't showing up in the tests. Right, so that's what leads us to the pandemic influenza, is the fact that no one was testing positive in a PCR test. So if you have influenza systems and a coroner says you have influenza, or a medical examiner says this body has influenza, and has influenza, it's post-mortem. Let's continue with Tucker and see where he's going with Dr. Fauci.
The experiments that clearly went so wrong. According to Richard E. Bright, quote, unfortunately, the NIAID director, that'd be Fauci, and the NIH director exploited this loophole to issue exemptions to projects subject to pause, preposterously asserting that the exempted research was, quote, urgently necessary to protect public health or national security, and thereby nullifying the pause.
Now, this sounds strangely similar to Operation Sea Spray, where this is urgently necessary to protect the public. When we read the story of Operation Sea Spray, the government thought that it was necessary to prepare for biological warfare by infecting the U.S. population. So in order to prepare for a hypothetical scenario that didn't yet happen, infecting people with bacteria seemed to be a good idea in the minds of the U.S. government. And that was Operation Sea Spray. And we read that story in Bedtime Stories recently. So it seems to me similar when they talk about urgently necessary to protect the public health or national security. That's why we should be doing gain of function work to be prepared for an attack that hasn't yet happened. I don't know. I think the American people who are paying for all this might disagree. So the question is, who is it in the government that thinks that this is what the American people want? Is it your congressman? Is it your senator that thinks this is what the American people want? If so, you might have to straighten them out a little bit, because I think most people find this a bit upsetting. Let's continue, Tucker.
This wouldn't have happened if Tony Fauci didn't allow it to happen. That is clear. It's an amazing story. It is a shocking story. In a functional country, there would be a criminal investigation currently underway into Tony Fauci's role in the COVID pandemic that has killed millions and halted our country and changed it forever.
All right, so we agree on that. So again, this is what I mean. It seems like Tucker's heart is in the right place. He's like a dog on the hunt, but he's barking up the wrong tree. And so what we need to do is sort of redirect Tucker, and let's get him looking where he should be looking, and that's the root cause of what just killed all these people. And the reason I'm so confident that it's not SARS-CoV-2 is because there aren't 10 dead in Shanghai or Beijing, according to Bruce Alward at The WHO, according, Taiwan. You don't have to just rely on China. You can look at Mongolia. You can look at Vietnam. You can look at Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, Malaysia, Myanmar, South Korea. States like Iowa have more people dead than Korea. States like Ohio have more people dead than all of Japan. So that's what leads me to believe there's something else. And then when we check the mortality systems at the CDC, we find, lo and behold, 550,000 P&I deaths in the last 18 months, or the last season and a half. Since October 2019, over 550,000 people have died in the United States from P&I. All right, so let's continue, Tucker.
So why isn't there a criminal investigation into Tony Fauci's role in this pandemic? Almost nobody is talking about COVID itself. What is this virus? How do you treat it? Dr. Peter McCullough is an internist and cardiologist from Dallas, Texas. He has a long and fairly famed history in medicine, which you can look up if you like, and you should.
Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Peter McCullough, and I'm an internist and cardiologist and professor of medicine at Texas A&M.
Now, this is a video clip that I had in my library. I downloaded it a couple weeks ago. This was something I was getting ready to work on, and then Tucker brought this Dr. McCullough on his Tucker Today show. Dr. McCullough gives an explosive testimony in front of the Senate. And what he broaches here on this show is a topic that we've been talking about here at Hypothetically Speaking for months now, which is therapeutic treatment for coronavirus. In other words, for months and months and months now, I've been saying there's this obsession with testing everybody, but there's no therapeutic treatment that's approved by both the FDA and the WHO, because remdesivir, which the FDA's approved, which is the Ebola treatment, is not approved by the WHO. The WHO doesn't like remdesivir, says it's not effective. So there's not one therapeutic that both the WHO and the FDA agree is effective. And remdesivir is intravenous. So you've got to be, it's not really like an outpatient, here's a prescription, go get your remdesivir. It's intravenously administered. You've got to be, in a situation for them to give it to you. And it was originally designed for Ebola, for which it did not receive FDA approval. But it did receive FDA approval for SARS-CoV-2, for which it was not originally designed. I think it is a vaccine for Ebola. So the fact that remdesivir was considered effective, I'm kind of curious why they didn't look into the Ebola vaccine as well, but what do I know? All right, so Dr. Peter McCullough brings out this issue that there's no FDA-approved therapeutic treatment for coronavirus. Now, his testimony, I believe, was in November of 2020. I started talking about this in January of 2021, I believe, formally in my videos. So let's take a closer look at what Dr. McCullough says, and then let's see where Tucker goes with Dr. McCullough, because I find this to be the most fascinating part.
University School of Medicine. I'm on the Baylor Dallas campus, and I've been integrally involved in the response to COVID-19. The opinions I'll express are those of my own and not necessarily those of my institution. I can tell you that in my field, I'm an academic doctor. I see patients, but I'm very involved in research. I'm an editor of 2 major journals. In my field, I'm the most published person in my field, which deals with the heart and the kidneys in the world in history. And when COVID-19 hit, I saw it as our medical Super Bowl. And there were going to be doctors like Dr. Urso coming out of wherever they worked to face the virus. And there were doctors in the hospital that just had to receive the virus. And then there were those who headed for the sidelines. And then there were those that were detractors against the pandemic. And so as I started to survey the literature, I had patients with heart and lung disease who needed urgent treatment. And I refused to let an illness, which lasted for 2 weeks at home before they got sick enough to be hospitalized, I refused to let a patient languish at home with no treatment and then be hospitalized when it was too late. It was obvious. That was obvious in April that was the case. So I used the best tools or drugs available at the time. And these are appropriately prescribed off-label. Remember, a label is an advertising label. A label isn't a scientific document. Sure, it's an appropriately prescribed off-label use of conventional medicine to treat an illness.
If you're a doctor listening to me right now and a patient with coronavirus feels like maybe they want to try that, and you're their doctor, you're not Anthony Fauci, the guy running the coronavirus task force right now, would you say, all right, we'll give it a whirl?
Yeah, of course. I mean, particularly if people have no other option, you want to give them hope. In fact, physicians in this country, these drugs are approved drugs for other reasons. They're anti-malaria drugs, and they're drugs against certain autoimmune diseases like lupus. Physicians throughout the country can prescribe that in an off-label way, which means they can write it for something that it was not originally approved for. People do that all the time, and it really is an individual choice between the physician and his or her patient as to whether or not they want to do that.
But more to the point, he has treated COVID a lot.
All right, so This notion that Dr. Fauci just introduced, which is it's between the doctor and the patient, we know that not to be true. We saw evidence of that in New York. Young woman, Jason Goodman, had a guest on his show. Of these off-label use scenarios that Dr. Fauci just described. And the pharmacy told her that Governor Cuomo would not allow it, that there was some sort of governor edict moratorium on these drugs, and they could not be dispensed at the pharmacy. So what Dr. Fauci is saying is that it's between the doctor and the patient whether to do the off-label. In practice, that turned out to not be the case, and we have testimony to that. So the other thing that we just heard in that clip was Dr. Fauci said, yes, he would prescribe it to his patients if it was appropriate. Right? So the issue, I think, or sort of the disconnect is that we had this massive undertaking to test everybody, yet if you were tested positive, they had nothing to give you as a therapeutic. Almost like we're going to test you, and if you're positive, we'll give you some rosary beads and a prayer card. Good luck. Make your peace with God and your family, and we hope you don't die. But thanks for coming in for the test. That was helpful. It sort of doesn't make sense. If we're going to test millions and millions of people, but we have nothing to give them if they're sick, the logic behind this massive testing undertaking is sort of hard to comprehend. So we were trying to bring attention to this, I guess, back in January of 2021. And so what's with this absolute craziness about the testing if there's no therapeutic treatment that's approved by the WHO and the FDA? There's no oral treatment, right? So at the time, and I think still, the only FDA-approved treatment is remdesivir, which is intravenous only. You have to be on, it's an intravenous administration of it. That's the only approved FDA therapeutic treatment for coronavirus. So that's the part that I think Tucker is realizing now. We were reporting this back in January at the latest. I mean, January is when I had videos on the topic. I think I was discussing it with Jason on the show on Fridays, but I'll show you some clips here to show you when we were talking about it. So let's see Tucker start to come to the realization that despite the fact that the United States had this massive testing campaign, there is no FDA-approved therapeutic treatment that's also approved by the WHO that can be prescribed to you that you can go and get filled at your pharmacy. There is no such thing. Let's watch Tucker figure this out.
And he knows a lot about it, and so we're grateful to have him with us today. Doctor, thanks so much for coming on. We appreciate
Thanks for having me.
Being here. So I just want to be clear at the outset. Here's why you're here. You're here because someone sent me last month videotape of testimony that you gave before the Texas Senate, State Senate.
This is actually kind of interesting. Tucker says the reason you're here is because somebody sent me a video of you sitting at the Texas Senate. So similar to the sort of stuff that I send to Laura, Tucker has sources that send him things that say, hey, check this out. He watches the videotape, and next thing you know, Peter McCullough's out on his show. So what Tucker's basically telling you there is that, he kind of got something from a friend of his who said, you got to check this out. And that's the same video clip that I had of Peter McCullough's testimony. So let's continue.
HHS committee on COVID. And you asked a question that I had heard, I don't think anybody asked ever. And it really stuck out. Here it is.
The average person in Texas thinks there's no treatment. I honestly think there's no treatment.
The only FDA-approved therapeutic treatment for coronavirus at the moment is intravenous remdesivir. Now, is that true? Let's go to the web and find out. Let's go to the internet.
They don't even know about these EUA antibodies. You heard from a 90-year-old gentleman who got bamlanivimab. Terrific. Where's the focus? There's such a focus on the vaccine. Where's the focus on people sick right now? This committee ought to know where all these monoclonal antibodies are. They ought to know where all the treatment protocols are. They ought to have a list of the treatment centers in Texas that actually treat patients with COVID-19.
Amazing. Where's the conversation about the treatment of COVID-19? That just, I have a big family. Most members of my family have been infected with COVID-19. Millions of Americans have. I still have never heard a conversation about how it's treated. Why?
It's because you need to be watching our show, Tucker, and you have heard this 5.5 months ago. So we were talking about this in January at the latest, and the topic was, why are we testing everybody if we have nothing to give them if they test positive? I just couldn't understand that. And now Tucker's waking up to it. All right, so our audience, you guys who've been watching the show now for, a couple months, couple years or what have you, you're seeing what it's like to be ahead of the story. And this is what I mean when I say sometimes it feels like we're from the future. It's like this stuff, and Tucker's just becoming aware of it now. So let's continue to watch him get red-pilled by Dr. McCullough.
Are we talking about this?
There's been a global oblivion to the idea of treating patients with COVID-19. And that's everything that's what Americans want to know. They want to know, doctor, what happens when I get COVID? How do I avoid 2 bad outcomes, hospitalization and death? So I looked at this. I got to tell you, there's 2 bad outcomes.
It just makes me laugh when you say that out loud because it's so obvious.
It's so obvious. Patients get sick. They're sick for about 2 weeks at home until they can't breathe anymore. And then they become hospitalized, and almost everybody dies in the hospital. So when I testified in the U.S. Senate, I said, listen, this pandemic response has 4 pillars. First one is try to control the spread. That's fine. Wear a mask, what have you. Second one is treat the problem and treat it early to avoid hospitalization and death. If people do go in the hospital, treat in the hospital. It's number 3. Number 4 is vaccination. So there's always 4-pronged approach. And what frustrates is in the media cycle, all we heard about was reducing spread from our public health officials, and then later on vaccination. We never actually heard about treating sick patients.
Before we get to what treatment exists for COVID, and I think there are treatments that some people, including me, even people who talk about it every day, aren't really aware of. Before we get to that, what is the answer to the question? Why haven't we discussed this? Why hasn't there been an emphasis on it?
I think there's been an enormous amount of fear, and for the first time in America, doctors and nurses and others were confronted with a disease that they themselves could contract and die from. And I think that fear drove everything. Remember early on in the news cycle, Americans learned about a term, PPE.
Yes.
What's that? Does that save a patient? No, that protects the doctors and nurses. We heard a lot about certainly masks and social distancing, what have you. Again, that's protecting well people. That's actually fear-driven. Like, oh, we could actually get it. Everything was fear-driven. There were actually a lot of doctors and hospitals that said, listen, we don't treat COVID. If it comes in, we'll play defense and we'll wear our PPE and deal with it in the hospital. So the real revolution was early on in the spring. I was communicating with colleagues in Milan. I'm an internist and cardiologist, trained epidemiologist. I'm not a virologist. I handle simple things like asthma, pneumonia, upper respiratory tract infections. And we were communicating with the Italians, and we said, what is going on? And they said, listen, this is like a cold, except the immune system goes crazy in the middle part of it, and then there's blood clotting and thrombosis.
Right.
And
now, P.S., that's almost exactly the same set of symptoms as the 1918 Spanish flu. Almost identical.
We have to do, if we continue.
And that's what can kill you.
That's what kills you. So we take an edge off the viral replication early, we treat the immune system dysregulation, and then we manage the blood clotting. We can get people through the illness. I said, terrific. We got together all of our findings. We published it in the American Journal of Medicine. In August of 2020 issue, the paper went viral. It's still the most downloaded paper in all of American Journal of Medicine regarding COVID. I just got the listing yesterday. It's still #1. I was never on social media. I was getting inundated with contacts, and my daughter, who came home from school, said, Daddy, why don't you make a YouTube video? I said, okay, I made a YouTube video. 4 slides. I wore a tie, and I can tell you, Tucker, there was nothing wrong about this video. It was simply a straight up, we looked for signals of efficacy in the literature, acceptable safety, and put drugs into combination for a regimen. And I four slides, I presented it in 20 minutes, it was up on YouTube, it went viral, and then it was struck down by YouTube. Violated terms of the community service, and I knew something was up.
What terms did they say it violated?
Didn't say.
How long was it off YouTube?
it was off, and I think several days, and fortunately I got some help from Senator Johnson in Washington, and ultimately this led to my U.S. Senate testimony on November 19th, and honestly, a real congealing of people that said, listen, something is up. There is an incredible suppression of early treatment in the medical literature.
Why would that is so dark? It's hard to believe that it's real, but of all people you would know. So why would physicians, public health officials, politicians try to suppress information about the treatment of a disease they claim they want to prevent or help America overcome? Why would they do that?
I testified in the U.S. Senate November 19th. We have seen things we cannot imagine in academic medicine. Lancet published a fake paper that came from a fake database that implied that hydroxychloroquine hurt people in the hospital. And we looked at it in 2 seconds. I knew it was a fake paper. They had 70,000 patients in a database that had detailed drug information. Back in December and going forward, we didn't have that back then. Mean age was 49. We don't hospitalize people at age 49. This went through peer review. It was agreed upon by all the editors. It hung up in Lancet for 2 weeks and scared the bejabbers out of the world by using hydroxychloroquine.
I remember that really well.
And this is the most frequently used, widely relied upon drug in the world, but something's going on.
Wait, so who, I'm sorry to back up and pardon my ignorance, I didn't even know this happened. I remember the paper very well because it had political uses at the time, because the then president had suggested maybe hydroxychloroquine would be a helpful therapy. And that paper was used to beat him over the head with it. But who would write a fake paper? Who did that? Do we know?
Well, it came from a company called Surgisphere, which rapidly dissolved. The Lancet published a retraction that said, we just couldn't verify the data, and so we're retracting it. No apologies, no explanation of how this could have influenced world events. It greatly influenced the FDA staffers who wrote an FDA warning, said, well, listen, we think hydroxychloroquine causes harm. Doctors shouldn't use this. It was based upon a fake paper. This went to the American Medical Association, then the Board of Pharmacies.
Is this a real story?
This is a real story. And doctors were writing prescriptions for hydroxychloroquine, and also their medical licenses are being threatened. There have been cases all over the country of doctors trying to help patients. And hydroxychloroquine is one of 4 to 6 drugs we use for COVID-19. It is extraordinary. Listen to this. April.
Wait, to this day, hydroxychloroquine is used?
Absolutely.
But I thought I heard on NBC News that hydroxychloroquine was poison. It was like fish tank cleaner and only quacks used it.
The best approaches use, if we can, we would use the antibodies that President Trump received, and those are EUA. Listen, that was Operation Warp Speed, terrific. The current product is Regeneron product. We use that up front. We can follow it in high-risk individuals with 2 drugs to reduce viral replication, typically hydroxychloroquine or ivermectin plus doxycycline or azithromycin. Outside the United States, they use favipiravir, which is oral remdesivir, approved and by regulatory agencies in 5 countries to treat COVID-19. No light of day in the United States for favipiravir. We can use these drugs early. Early is very important. Remdesivir 2 weeks later, not very impressive. And then very importantly, inhaled steroids and then oral steroids in that middle phase. And then we use aspirin and blood thinners on the back end, just like we do in the hospital. It's called sequence multi-drug therapy. I published the follow-up paper in Reviews in Cardiovascular Medicine in December of 2020, the most widely cited paper from that journal for COVID-19, a dedicated issue. And this became the basis for the American early treatment movement. In the United States today, we have 4 national telemedicine services, 15 regional telemedicine services, 250 treating doctors. We risk stratify according to over age 50 or multiple medical problems. That means only 10 to maybe 25% of people really need to be treated. Young people don't. And we get them through the illness with avoiding hospitalization and death. And if you look at the data, we're on a pretty high plateau for cases in the United States of COVID-19, and the hospitals are not overflowing. In fact, hospitals have a very manageable workload. So our viewpoint is that early treatment is a really important part of the pandemic response. Vaccination will complement what we're doing, but this idea of scrubbing early treatment in favor of keeping the population in fear in order to potentially better accept mass vaccination, I think has done a disservice. I testified.
And do you think that was the motive? I mean, I'm not a scientist, I'm a big picture guy. Why is this happening?
The two are so tightly linked, it is unbelievable. So The pressure to suppress any hope of treatment is extraordinary, and it's in the minds of doctors all over the world through their medical societies, their journals, their public health committee. How many times has anybody come on from the CDC, the NIH, the FDA ever, and gone for America and say, you know what, we have an early treatment approach, or see your doctor regarding early treatment, or we're going to support doctors to use their innovation and put drugs together in combination. Listen, this is a fatal virus. Single drugs don't work. They don't work for HIV or hepatitis C. Everybody knew that. So the idea of, oh, we're going to do a single drug and see if that saves the world. No, we look for signals of benefit and then acceptable safety, use drugs in combination. What we showed is that doing this, 2 separate papers, Zelenko in New York, Proctor in Dallas, 85% reductions in hospitalizations and death. But we have to start early. We can't just let people get sick at home.
Okay, everything you're saying makes sense to the extent I understand it as a non-expert. But I still just have to bring you back to the question of why, because I can't get past it. That's so reckless and, well, evil. If you're suppressing treatment of a life-threatening disease, you're committing evil. You're ensuring people die, and yet clearly that's happened. You say it's in order to encourage people to take a vaccine. That began before there was a vaccine, for one thing. But even after the advent of the vaccine, why the single-minded focus on the vaccine? What is that? And by the way, I'm not making a case against vaccines, but what is that about?
I'm very pro-vaccine. I've received every vaccine that's evidence-based and indicated. My patients have gotten the COVID-19 vaccine. My family members have gotten.
Well, you're an American. All Americans get vaccines. I mean, no one's against vaccines.
We're not against vaccines. I had published an op-ed last summer in The Hill, and the title of it was "The Great Gamble of the COVID-19 Vaccine Development Program." And the point of that paper was, we are putting all of our eggs in one basket. And it was pretty clear. All of our intellectual eggs, we're going to stake everything on American and worldwide ingenuity, working together with the World Health Organization, Operation Warp Speed, Gates Foundation, all the regulatory agencies for a mass vaccination program for the world. It was a stake that was taken, and you saw the tenor of this: needles in all the arms, army trucks rolling out with men with refrigerated vaccines, and get a needle into every arm. What I've been saying is that, listen, that's terrific, but we ought to have a tenor of safety, safety, safety. If we're going to put out a vaccine and we're going to say we're going to mass vaccinate the world, we better be hawks on safety. Independent data safety and monitoring boards, we better be looking at every event being reported into the safety databases and assure America that the program is safe, as we've kind of...
And we're going to get to that, but I just want to back up a third time because I can't control myself. Why the single-minded focus on the vaccine? I understand completely someone puts a stake in the ground and that's the goal, and you can't avert your eyes from it, and you're all in on the goal. But why is that the goal?
I'm a doctor. I treat patients one by one.
All right. Tucker is struggling with this. And if you guys have been listening to bedtime stories, you may already know why. So I'm going to flip over to the browser, and we're going to go visit the US FDA, and we're going to look at their website and see what they have to say about emergency use authorization for vaccines. So right now we're at the FDA, US Food and Drug Administration, FDA.gov, and the article that we're reading, Emergency Use Authorization for Vaccines Explained. What is an emergency use authorization, EUA? An emergency use authorization is a mechanism to facilitate the availability and use of medical countermeasures, including vaccines, during public health emergencies, such as the current COVID-19 pandemic. Under an EUA, FDA may allow the use of unapproved medical products or unapproved uses of approved medical products in an emergency to diagnose, treat, or prevent serious or life-threatening diseases or conditions when certain statutory criteria have been met, including And now here's the part, Tucker, that you need to pay attention to. So the FDA may allow the use of an unapproved medical product or medical products if, including that there are no adequate, approved, and available alternatives. So in other words, if there is an adequate, available alternative, emergency use authorization is not granted. And the vaccines have to go through the entire clinical trial process and FDA approval process. We know that both the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines have received emergency use authorization. We know that Pfizer has applied for full FDA approval, but has not yet been granted that. So both of the two big vaccines in the United States, the Pfizer and Moderna, are still under emergency use authorization. But it's this aspect that says the statutory criteria have to be met, including that there are no adequate, approved, and available alternatives. So if you're motivated to make sure that these vaccines were to receive an emergency use authorization, that's not going to happen if there's an available alternative. So, Tucker, hypothetically speaking, that might be the reason why. I'm John Cullen. Thanks for joining Hypothetically Speaking.